should have been skeletal muscle. What I need you guys to do is to make sure that that starts getting more comfortable, right? So the effector for the somatic nervous system is skeletal muscle. And the effect of the somatic nervous system on skeletal muscle is always what? Excitatory or inhibitory? Excitatory, good. Okay, so then we're going to compare that to the autonomic nervous system, which is more complicated and has less predictable effects. However, we are going to get to the point that we can predict relatively effectively today. Okay, so last time, briefly, we talked about the afferent nervous system. We're not going to concentrate on that today, but just conceptually, if the efferent nervous system takes information from the CNS through the PNS to effectors, what the afferent nervous system does is takes information from receptors through the PNS to the CNS, right? Yeah? Okay, so every single sensation that you have, as we mentioned, comes to the CNS for integration, but we're not aware of them unless they go to the cerebral cortex, okay? And as far as the types of sensations you have your general senses, touch, temperature, pressure, pain, and then your special senses, which you learned in kindergarten, right? Sight, smell, hearing, I can't ever remember the other two. And then now we're going to move on to the efferent nervous system. So the efferent nervous system carries information in the form of action potentials from the CNS to effectors. And effectors are things that you can effect a change on. Okay, so now let's start talking about somatic versus autonomic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a big diagram that we're going to be working on the entire class period. So I'm going to talk about what's in the CNS, what's in the PNS, what the effector is, and what the effect is, which would be excitation or inhibition. And in this entire lecture, we're going to be talking about the efferent nervous system. Okay? So the whole thing is going to be efferent. But we're going to start out by talking about the SNS, or somatic nervous system. Okay? And you already know this. We're just going to use it as a comparison contrast. So with the somatic nervous system, what it's going to do is it's always going to control the same effector. And you guys know the effector for the somatic nervous system is? Skeletal muscle, exactly. So when I am doing this, and I'll add in some details later, the somatic nervous system is often called the voluntary nervous system because at least some of the time you can control it voluntarily, okay? Because the somatic nervous system is mapped to the cerebral cortex. And this may be like not super familiar with you guys, but I want to try to put it together for those of you who remember this. So, do you remember vaguely in anatomy how you talked about the fact that the post-central gyrus, okay, was responsible for, the pre-central gyrus was responsible for motor innervation of the opposite side of the body. Does that sound familiar to you? I know you do, because we just talked about it. So the pre-central gyrus was responsible for motor innervation, and it's really the cerebral cortex, right? In the pre-central gyrus, it's called, and for instance, this part where I'm actually moving my hand would be mapped to about right here on the pre-central gyrus in this side. So what I'm saying here is that the cerebral cortex is responsible for controlling skeletal muscle activity, and we actually know specifically which portion of the cerebral cortex is controlling skeletal muscle activity for which portion of the opposite side of the brain, okay? And the important part about that is simply that if you control it with the cerebral cortex, it can be voluntary. Yes? Okay. Is it always voluntary? No, right? Because you can't stop shivering if you need to shiver to increase your body temperature, but it is at least possibly voluntary. Okay, so the efferent route, if we're trying to get from the central nervous system through the somatic nervous system to the effector, the efferent route is actually relatively simple anatomically, and I'll show it to you and then I'll simplify it on the board and then we'll use it as a comparison. Okay, so here's the deal. If I'm trying to control a skeletal muscle fiber, the neuron cell body to do it is in the CNS. So I'm going to try to control the muscle in my little toe. The neuron that's going to do it is actually going to be in the lumbar region of my spinal cord. The cell body is there. And the only thing that runs through the nerve, it's going to be the sciatic nerve, by the way, and the branches of the sciatic the only thing that's going to run through that is going to be an axon, and it's going to synapse onto those muscle cells down there. Okay, so that means that the only thing that runs through the PNS is a single axon. There's one synapse on the way there. It's very simple anatomy on the way there. Okay? And you already know, but tell me, the neurotransmitter that's released here. Acetylcholine. And the effect is always excitatory or inhibitory. Okay. Okay, so we'll use that as a jumping off point to compare the other ones. Okay? It's good, right? Simple. Okay, so, and we know, of course, that it forms what we call a neuromuscular junction. So now let's compare that to the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is called the involuntary nervous system or the visceral motor, and visceral means guts because it's controlling your gut function primarily. And so what's going to happen with that one is, first off, it doesn't hook up to your cerebral cortex. It hooks up to involuntary portions of your brain, like the pons, like the medulla oblongata, like the hypothalamus. So those regions you can't control voluntarily, right? Those are not voluntary or conscious portions of your brain, okay? So this is the involuntary nervous system. So it's involuntary and automatic control. What are the effectors for the autonomic nervous system? There are three. Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Okay, now I'm not going to draw all three. What I'm actually going to do is just draw cardiac muscle because it's easiest to see in a bad drawing. Okay. And then what I'm going to tell you is the pathway from the central nervous system to the effector is more complicated. Okay, and we're going to use it to compare. So what's going to happen is the efferent route from the CNS to the effector is going to be more complicated. It's not dramatically more complicated, although the physiology is a little bit complex. So here's the basics. You're going to have one neuron. Its cell body is going to be in the CNS. Okay? And then on its way there, it is going to form a synapse with another neuron. And its cell body is not in the CNS, and then it's going to form a synapse with the effector. Now, this location right here is not going to have a single neuron in it. It's going to be a blob of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. Do you remember what you call a blob of neurons in the PNS? Ganglion. Yes, a ganglion. Okay, so this is going to be a ganglion. And because we know its function, we can call it an autonomic ganglion. That cool with everybody? Okay. Now, based on the anatomy that you understand already and the physiology that you understand already, you know that if you see two neurons in series, you can tell which direction information is flowing, correct? Okay. So now, you could very easily label one of these two the preganglionic neuron and the other one the postganglionic neuron, correct? So this is what? Preganglionic neuron, and this is postganglionic neuron. And so we're going to have two synapses on our way there, and by the time we're finished talking today, we will know what neurotransmitter is released there and what effect it has, and we'll know what neurotransmitter is released here and what effect it has. That make sense? So it just takes a little while to build the story. Okay, so let me show you just a diagram of that as well. So the simplest diagram of that relationship is this one right here. It's the same thing we just built. Preganglionic, autonomic ganglion, postganglionic, and then the effector organs, right? This is the same one from your textbook. Okay. Yeah, adipose tissue actually has some receptors for these. We don't usually talk about it in this set of notes, but we actually do talk about it in the endocrine system because you release the same things as hormones as you do neurotransmitters. Okay, so the other thing that's going to be really important here is that whereas This skeletal muscle fiber will have a single hookup. What you're going to have in the autonomic system is what we talked about last time. You have dual innervation. Remember how I talked about the fact that the heart has two hookups? And one of the hookups will turn it up and one of the hookups will turn it down. So what we're actually going to have to do is we're going to have to take this and bust it out into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. That was my child. Okay, so I'm going to basically make this into two different diagrams, okay? So I'm going to end up at the same place. I'm going to have dual innervation of cardiac muscle, right? But the autonomic has sympathetic and parasympathetic functions, right? So I'm going to redraw this and add a little bit of detail to it. So same thing, CNS, PNS, effector, and effect. Okay, we're going to end up at the same effector. So we're going to draw a big, huge cardiac muscle cell. And we're going to start out with some similar anatomy with slight differences. Okay, so first is the sympathetic. Has short preganglionic axons and long postganglionic axons. Just a little anatomical difference. And the parasympathetic is the opposite. Long pre. And short post. But please note that they end up at the same place, right? Dual innervation. Still pre, still post. Good? I'll let you catch up for just a second. So we have dual innervation. There's going to be two synapses that form on a single tissue. Now, concept check before we go any further. Just a conceptual thing. Does it make logical sense to you that these two, sympathetic and parasympathetic, listen for just a second instead of writing, they can't release the same neurotransmitter and cause two different impacts on the identical cell, right? Does it make sense to you that they're going to have to release two different neurotransmitters if they're communicating two different messages to the same tissue, right? Okay, so they are going to ultimately release two different neurotransmitters onto the tissue, right? That's how one of them is going to turn the heart up and one of them is going to turn the heart down, okay? So eventually we'll add in what they are. So two synapses form on the tissue. They're going to be either excitatory or inhibitory, and it's going to depend primarily on the receptors that are present on the tissue. Okay, so before we add any more detail, let's just back up and talk a little bit about why the hell you guys have to know this, because it is wordy and it's nobody's favorite set of notes, just so you know. But if you end up controlling three effectors, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, and you guys are going into something related to human health, right? That's what you'd like to do. You're going to end up controlling these body systems by controlling cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And so what I want you to do is, if I tell you cardiovascular function, I want you to think about how the autonomic nervous system, for instance, controls cardiovascular function. Obviously, it's controlling cardiac muscle, but what about the rest of it? Cardiovascular function, autonomic nervous system controls cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. What else? Cardiovascular function. Yes, vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Isn't that the vast majority of cardiovascular function right there? Yeah. Heart function and vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Okay, now next one. Respiratory function. What the autonomic nervous system does not do is control the diaphragm, because that's skeletal muscle, but it does control the diameter of the bronchioles, right? Which is respiratory function. Next one, digestive function. Digestive function is contraction and secretion. Okay, contraction is what kind of tissue? And digestive function? Smooth muscle. And secretion is? Glands, exactly. Urinary function. Urinary function is basically mostly smooth muscle function, is what it is. Smooth muscle, both controlling the pressure that goes to the kidneys and then controlling the contraction of the ureters, urethra, and bladder. Okay, and then last but not least, reproductive function is just a big freaking smooth muscle and gland party, is all it is, right? Everything from erection to ejaculation is smooth muscle and glands, right? So hormone secretion is, of course, glandular function. Does that make sense? Now, if you look at these functions, those body systems, aren't those the vast majority of the body systems that cause you to seek out medical help in the first place? Okay? So you need a basic understanding of how they're wired up and how they are supposed to function. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here. Okay? All right, so there are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And most autonomic effector organs, as I mentioned, are dually innervated. There's double innervation. And so let's just back up and revisit what the sympathetic nervous system does and the parasympathetic nervous system does. The sympathetic nervous system activates fight or flight responses, right? And so what happens with the sympathetic nervous system is during exercise or fight or flight situations, you tend to turn on the sympathetic nervous system. And it does what it does to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. We'll try to figure out how to predict that in just a second. And then the parasympathetic nervous system tends to do the opposite to the same tissues. So imagine them like working in concert on the same tissues. So for instance, you don't need to memorize very much because if you knew, and you do probably already, that the sympathetic nervous system turns cardiac muscle up, then do you have to memorize what the parasympathetic nervous system does? No, because they generally do the opposite on the tissues, right? So as long as you can make one of them make sense, you can figure out the other one, right? Okay, so they tend to work in opposition of one another. I'm going to just going to remind you of some of the anatomy. I don't know how many of you guys did this anatomy when you were in anatomy, but as far as the anatomy goes, you remember this? Do you remember this? Yeah? No? Okay. Oh, wait. Assuming you've had anatomy. Okay. You poor souls. Okay. Are you going to take anatomy next semester? Yeah. Okay. All right. It should be really easy for you after you did the phys. Okay. So here's the deal. This looks super duper complicated and overwhelming, but it's actually not. So what you see is in the middle, we're actually ending up at the same organs, right? We've got two different pathways to the same organs, right? Because obviously we don't have two different central nervous systems. Yes? Okay. Two different pathways to the same organ. So here's what I want to tell you just about the basic anatomy of this. What I want to tell you is that if I'm using the sympathetic nervous system, I'm going to follow one anatomical pathway to, for instance, the heart. Yes? But if I am using the parasympathetic nervous system, I'm going to follow a different anatomical pathway to the heart. Okay? So let's just talk about the heart for a second and figure out how the hell you increase or decrease the heart rate anatomically. Like, how do you get there? Okay? So right now, there's no tiger in the room. We have no test, right? So which branch of the autonomic nervous system is controlling my cardiac muscle? Parasympathetic. So let's follow it to get it there, okay? The parasympathetic nervous system, if you look at it, it's easy to figure out when you're looking at parasympathetic because the innervation comes from 4 different cranial nerves and then not a damn thing in the middle until you get down to the sacral nerves. So for anatomists who don't care about functionality, they call the parasympathetic nervous system the craniosacral division, okay? And if you know some hippies like I do, they like to talk about craniosacral therapy. Have you ever heard that? They don't know what the hell those words mean, but they're going to charge you some money, right, for it, okay? I like my hippie friends, but I don't take advice from them, okay? I will buy incense from them, whatever. So, okay. So let's follow it, right? So now what is my heart doing? Here's the question. My heart is settling down, right? It does not need to be very fast because I do not need it to be. So what's going to happen is no tiger in the room. The impact is going to come from my medulla oblongata. I'm going to follow it out. Cranial nerve number 10, which is the what? Vagus nerve. And I am going to end up at my heart. And I'm going to release a neurotransmitter to be named later that will slow down my heart activity. But now, tiger walks into the room. Here's what happens. This one goes, I am out. I am no longer useful in this situation. And then what happens is my brain identifies tiger, goes, oh shit, tiger. And then you go a different anatomical path. What happens is the anatomical path to the heart now from the sympathetic nervous system comes from the thoracic and a little bit of the lumbar region of the spinal cord. And it's going to come out and then go to the heart that way, right? That makes sense? Okay, so that's just the anatomy to put together with the physiology. It is actually like there is an anatomical connection. I don't usually test on this, but do you see, I mean, not much on it, but do you see now with just that information, if I showed you something that was hooked up craniosacral, you could tell me it was Parasympathetic, and thoracic and a little bit of lumbar. You could tell me it was? Sympathetic. Good. Okay.
Good question.
Go ahead.
What is the use for them being in separate places? Coming from like separate routes?
I don't know that I've ever assessed that question before. What? Well, spinal cord injury will...
Potentially damage one, but that would be like your reason for origination.
I think it's probably just an evolutionary anomaly that it just actually worked out that way. But there are advantages. So why it developed that way, I don't know that I have enough historical perspective to actually answer that question. What is the advantage to it developing that way? The advantage to it developing that way is that I can keep normal functionality of almost all of my life-sustaining organs with spinal cord injury all the way up to about C2, right? Now, I lose control of my junk and my bladder, right? But those are not life-sustaining, despite what you think when you're a teenager, right? Those are not life-sustaining. Go ahead.
I guess, okay, so there's like four or five routes sympathetic to the heart, or is there only one from the parasympathetic?
No, there actually is one, and then it branches. This one, actually, you're not seeing all the branches. This one comes from about 4 different regions, but they all come together right here.
Well, I'm saying, like, say there's a tiger in the room, could you send that message, like, more frequently, dump it faster?
Maybe. It actually synapses on SA node and AV node. But as far as getting it started, maybe it does get it started faster. That's an interesting hypothesis that I've never actually addressed before. Those are good questions. I don't know the answers to them. If you figure them out, you can teach me. Okay, so generally, these two work in opposition to one another, sympathetic and the parasympathetic. There are exceptions to that. We'll come to the exceptions in just a second. Okay, so now, how do you predict what it's going to do on an organ? And then we'll add in the details of how it does it on the organs, okay? So... we have our 4 F's, right? Fighting, fleeing, feeding, and breeding, okay? And that's what these are going to control. But generally, here's what I need for you guys to be able to do before we get into the details. Anytime I say autonomic nervous system, you should be able to answer for me whether I'm talking about afferent or efferent. What do you think? Efferent. Is it part of the CNS or part of the PNS? PNS, part of the PNS, okay? And it is mainly under control of the hypothalamus, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, not the cerebral cortex, which means that you don't really have the direct capacity to control it voluntarily. Now, I will talk about the exceptions that you've heard later of CIA agents being able to inhibit their heart rate increase, but that's an exception, that's an anomaly. And that does happen on occasions, but most of us can't do that. And there are 2 divisions. There's going to be the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So now we're just going to do a tour to see if we can figure out the pattern that allows us to predict whether the sympathetic or the parasympathetic would increase or decrease the activity of any organ. And here's what you use as a predictive. You use resource allocation, right? That's what I use. And it works damn near all the time, with the exception of sexuality, which is just weird. So in each of these situations, I'm going to give you an organ, and then there are 3 possible tissues I could be controlling. With the autonomic nervous system, it's always going to be what? Cardiac, smooth, and gland. So I'm going to ask you to tell me the tissue in each instance, right? And then I am going to tell you what the sympathetic nervous system does to it, and then you're going to tell me whether it represents excitation or inhibition, okay? And hopefully what will happen by the time you get to the end of this table, you are going to feel good about your capacity for predicting another organ, right? So here, what I'm doing is not giving you a comprehensive list of sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system activity. I'm trying to teach you how to predict the next organ that isn't on the list, okay? All right, so first, the eye. What we are going to control is the diameter of the pupil. Good? Okay. Now, before we go any further, which of the 3 tissues is responsible for that? Smooth muscle. It's going to be smooth muscle. Okay, and the sympathetic nervous system is going to dilate the pupil. Can anybody make that make sense to me? Why the sympathetic nervous system would dilate the pupil?
Just so that you can get in more information.
Exactly. The tiger is coming at me. I want to be able to see every single chink in the tiger armor, right? Maybe there's some place I could poke to get myself not eaten. Okay, so the tissue is smooth muscle, but in order for you to figure out whether dilation represents excitation or inhibition, I have to show you that anatomy. I don't know if you know that anatomy or not. So here's the pupil, which is a hole, right? And here is how the smooth muscle fibers are set up around the hole. So, and think of that as the origin-ish and that as the insertion-ish, okay? And now, tell me, should I excite that to dilate it or inhibit it to dilate it? Excite it to dilate it. Does that make sense? Okay, that's just based on that anatomy. Good? Okay, and of course, it's worth the ATP, it's worth the resources to try to get more information in. So that represents excitation to cause dilation. And then the parasympathetic nervous system, in order to constrict the pupil, what would I have to do? Excite it or inhibit it? Exactly, okay. So salivary gland is next. Salivary gland is what kind of tissue? Gland, good. You'd be surprised how much silence I get in response to that question. And the sympathetic nervous system decreases secretion. How does that make sense to you?
You're not gonna eat when a tiger's
Right, that's a digestive functionality, right? If the tiger is going to eat you, he can digest your damn egg McMuffin for himself, right? You're not going to like help the tiger, okay? So it decreases secretion, okay? And does that represent excitation or inhibition? That one's easy. Inhibition. And then, of course, the parasympathetic nervous system increases secretion, which represents? Good. Okay. Lungs, specifically the bronchial diameter. What kind of tissue can control the bronchial diameter? Smooth muscle. It's a different anatomy, so let me show you the anatomy to allow you to figure out what's going on here. The bronchial smooth muscle is arranged like that. Okay, so now let's figure out how we can dilate the bronchioles. Should I excite and contract those or inhibit and relax them? Inhibit, right? If you stimulate them, they will decrease the diameter of the bronchiole, right? So I inhibit to allow for bronchial dilation, and then the parasympathetic excites to allow for bronchial constriction. And I know you know, but let's just make sure that you can say it out loud. Why are the bronchioles dilated during sympathetic stimulation? Yeah, more oxygen, more air, right? More nutrients. Okay, the heart, which tissue? Oh my gosh, you guys are so much more awake than the last class. Although they did really well for 8:30 on the autonomic nervous system. Okay, increases heart rate, of course, which should make perfect logical sense to you. And that represents excitation or inhibition? Excitation, exactly. And then the parasympathetic decreases heart rate, which represents inhibition. Okay. And then the stomach and intestines, we've got two things going on with stomach and intestines. We've got motility and secretion, two different tissues. Motility is? Secretion is? That's good. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system, does it make sense to you that the sympathetic nervous system decreases motility and secretion? Yeah? Because that's digestive functionality, right? And you can't afford it when you're about to die. So that represents excitation or inhibition. What do you think? Inhibition. It's inhibition, exactly. And the parasympathetic nervous system increases motility and secretion, and that represents excitation. So hopefully what you proved to yourself by following through that is you disproved the misconception that the sympathetic nervous system excites everything and the parasympathetic nervous system inhibits everything. And you will never think that again, right? Because it doesn't make sense with finite resources. But now let's get to one that's slightly more complicated to make sure that you can understand how the hell this could occur. Okay, so now with these next two, what I'm going to do is control the diameter of arteries and arterioles leading to certain capillary beds. You guys with me? Okay, so arteries that are supplying skin and viscera. By viscera, think abdominal pelvic cavity, digestive, reproductive, and urinary functions. Okay, so blood vessels supplying skin and viscera versus blood vessels supplying skeletal muscles, right? I'm not talking about skeletal muscle innervation. I'm talking about blood vessels supplying skeletal muscles. Okay, so the arteries that are supplying skin and viscera, it's all smooth muscle, right? In both of them, okay? But what we're going to see is they are going to respond differently to the same stimulation, which can be pretty damn confusing, but you can figure it out. Okay, the arteries that are supplying the skin and the viscera, finite amount of blood, tiger in the damn room, okay? How much blood do I need to go to my skin and my viscera? Very little, right? Enough to keep them alive, and that's about it, right? So should they constrict or dilate? They should constrict. And in order for you to understand how they will constrict, they have the same anatomy as a bronchiole. So should you excite them to constrict them or inhibit them? Excite, Okay, so you will excite those. Now, the net effect of that, by the way, since you have so many blood vessels leading to your skin and your viscera, if you constrict so many blood vessels simultaneously, it tends to bump up your blood pressure. Of course, you're also increasing your heart rate, which bumps up your blood pressure. But collectively, you know, when you're stressed out, what tends to happen to your blood pressure? It goes up, exactly. But not all of your vessels are constricting, because that wouldn't be helpful in that situation. The blood vessels that are going to your skeletal muscle should do what? Dilate. Exactly. That makes sense? Okay. Because I need more blood to go to my skeletal muscles, right? So those are going to dilate. Same anatomy, though. Okay. So how are you going to dilate those? Are you going to excite them or inhibit them? Inhibit them. So now we come back to a strange little situation in which the same tissue in two different regions of the body has a different response to the same neurotransmitter. Are you all right?
I'm excited. All these
Sympathetic nervous system. Okay, all right. Okay, tiger, yes. I lost my train of thought because there's a damn tiger in the room. Okay, so how does it do that? Same neurotransmitter.
Different receptors.
Exactly. Two different receptors in two different parts of the body. Exactly. Pretty much. Two different receptors in two parts of the body. Okay, the other important thing right here is that I'm going to say this about 10 times throughout the rest of the semester. There's no parasympathetic innervation of the smooth muscle in the walls of blood vessels anywhere. So here is how, in the first situation, the artery supplying the skin and the viscera, in order to dilate with those, all I do is dilation occurs via reduced sympathetic stimulation. So if I have more sympathetic stimulation, I constrict. If I reduce sympathetic stimulation, I dilate.
They just know.
Yeah, they just normally dilate. And they always have sympathetic stimulation, so it's one of the few places in which the sympathetic nervous system isn't just fight or flight. It's like normal innervation, but more of it is fight or flight, okay? And in the other situation, the artery supplying skeletal muscle, more sympathetic stimulation causes dilation, and less sympathetic stimulation causes constriction. But in both of those situations, you have no parasympathetic innervation at all, okay? It's just a weird situation in which there's no dual innervation, right? It's all sympathetic. It's just more or less sympathetic, okay? All right, and then the last situation is the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla, where's your adrenal glands? Yeah, above your kidneys. And anytime you have a medulla, I don't know if you guys know this, but if you probably do. If you have a cortex and a medulla, which one's where? Cortex is outside, medulla is inside, okay? Whether it's the kidneys, the ovaries, the adrenal gland, or the brain. Cortex is outside, medulla is inside. Good? Okay, so the adrenal medulla is hooked up to the sympathetic nervous system. And what happens with the adrenal medulla is that when the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla, we actually end up dumping neurotransmitter-like chemicals into the bloodstream, and then you're going to end up getting a hormonal response. So let's talk about this briefly. What's going to happen here is we can look at it that way, or we can look at it this way. Let me go back here just a second. Okay, so don't worry about the details too much, but see, we are going to have innervation of the adrenal gland right there. Okay, all right, so with the adrenal medulla, what's going to happen is the sympathetic nervous system is going to cause it to dump neurotransmitter-like chemicals into the bloodstream. And what that's going to do is it's going to prolong a nervous system response so that it can become a hormonal response. Okay? So, nervous system responses are short-lived and they're local, right? Okay? And they're expensive. Can we agree that nervous system responses are short-lived, local, and expensive? Okay. What if it's going to take me more than 30 seconds to get away from the tiger? And I need to release not a little bit of the neurotransmitter, but a lot of the neurotransmitter? Well, how about I just dump it into the bloodstream instead? Isn't that more economical to do? Right? Isn't dumping it into the bloodstream more economical than repeated action potentials to cause this release of the same neurotransmitter? So what this one does is the adrenal medulla is going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream, and that represents an excitation, and it is only hooked up to the sympathetic nervous system. It's not hooked up to the parasympathetic nervous system. What that does is enhances and prolongs the fight or flight response, and this matters, and you've experienced this before. I know that you have, so I want to imagine for a second the last time you were on I-15 and somebody almost killed you, right? Because that happens all the damn time, right? Because we live here. It will happen with me if you allow me to drive in the snow, because I don't know about snow. I don't know what the hell snow is all about. I'm from Texas. We didn't have snow. And I am like this person in snow. You guys can just come pick me up if you want to, really. It's like better for everybody. Okay, so you're on the highway and somebody almost kills you. So I want you to think about, if you looked in the mirror, what would you see with your pupils? They would dilate, right? Respiratory rate goes up, which is not directly sympathetic, but will be because of sympathetic. How about sweat? Your body temperature will heat up eventually, and you're going to start sweating. Blood pressure, if you had measured it, what would it do? Right? Heart rate? Go up? Exactly. So salivary glands, have you ever noticed how? Yeah. And I don't know if you noticed this, but it also turns off your digestive tract, which you probably don't notice until it turns back on 15 minutes later and you get the squirts. Right? You're like, oh, apparently don't have time to poop. But then if you're still on the highway 15 minutes later, now you have a really terrible morning because now you need to crap and you're still stuck in traffic. Okay, so, but the other thing is, if it's really massive and you truly thought you were going to die for a second, what's going to happen is, instead of it just being nervous, it's going to involve hormones, and you're going to dump adrenaline, epinephrine into your bloodstream. Okay. And then even when you figure out that you're not going to die, is your heart rate going to go back down immediately? No, and your respiratory rate and everything's not going to go back down immediately, because when you dump it as a hormone, you have to clear it out of the system, right? And you have to clear it via the target cells breaking it down, or the liver, or the kidneys breaking it down, and it's not instant, right? It takes a little while to clear it. How long? Depends on how much of it you release, right? It could be minutes, it could be half an hour. I mean, you've gotten into those situations before, right? Where you almost died, and it's like a long time before you get rid of it.
How does this relate to shock?
It does. Shock is, you're going to have to hold on to that one, because that's like a 15-minute answer. But we will do it in cardiovascular system when we talk about shock. It's a good question. We just don't quite have time to do it, and we don't have enough background yet, but we will. Make sure you ask it in cardiovascular system. Okay, so this matters because you're going to have the stuff coursing through your veins, and it's going to have arteries, really, and it's going to have a little while before it gets cleared out of the system. And that impacts your life, too. Have you ever gotten into a situation in which you really jazz yourself up for a fight, right? And so maybe not a physical fight, right? But so let's say you're about to have an argument with your significant other, right? And you know how right you are. You are so sure how right you are. You're like, I have built this up. I have a list in my head, and you go and you say, all right, so we got to talk about this, because when you do this, I feel this way, and I think you do it because of this, and this is why it pisses me off, and this is what your mom does, and this is why you suck. And so you got the whole list, right? And you know that as soon as you pull out the mom card, there's going to be blows. But then your significant other remembers how you guys went to therapy, and you go, oh, sorry you feel that way. You're totally right. And then what do? You're like, I don't like your tone. Keep going, right? It's because your epinephrine is coursing, and you need to go for a walk, is what you need to do. Because you got 30 minutes of idiocy, and you might as well be by yourself while that's happening. Remember it too when you're a parent, because when your kids get into full-blown sympathetic nervous system, and you're like, calm down. I said calm down. They can't calm down. They've got this stuff coursing through their veins. You need to let them go into a room where they can smack on something that's not going to hurt, right? Okay. So last little tidbit about this is, let me revisit the idea of cerebral cortex override, and then we'll talk about polygraphs, and then we'll move on and fill in the neurotransmitters. Okay, so you have heard, I know you have, about yogis and monks and CIA agents who can keep their heart rate from, for instance, going up when otherwise people would have their heart rates go up, right? Control their body temperature to a certain degree, control their heart rate. How the hell does that work? They do not rewire the anatomy. It doesn't happen. Okay, the nervous system was set up before birth. What does happen, however, is you can train your cerebral cortex to override what your hypothalamus is telling your body, right? So your heart rate starts to increase, but you train your cerebral cortex over and over again to like calm down your brain, calm down your brain, calm down your brain. And with a lot of practice, you can get some degree of control. Your cerebral cortex is not controlling your heart, but your cerebral cortex is overriding what your hypothalamus is doing. Does that make sense? So you're not wiring it any differently, you're training it differently. It's basically like biofeedback, right? Okay, if you continue to feel what's going on and you exert a change and it has an effect, then you can repeat that change, right? Go ahead. You're inhibiting the sympathetic response is what you're doing, inhibiting the sympathetic response. And people can get pretty effective at doing that with lots and lots of training. Most of us could not do it at all, right? So now let's also talk about polygraph tests and lie detector tests and how those are related to this story. Those are related to this story because when someone gives you a polygraph, so what they're going to do is they're going to hook you up, and there's a bunch of different mechanisms of doing polygraph, but they can assess such things as pupil dilation. They can assess heart rate and blood pressure, and they can also assess the conductivity of the skin because generally sympathetic nervous system increases your body temperature and your skin increases conductivity. They can also assess respiratory rate. So how does this work? If I go in for a polygraph, generally people who are not sociopaths feel slight stress from lying because there's the stress of the potential social isolation, judgment, punishment. If you're religious, you get it even more because you think God's watching you, right? You're like, right? If you're like a heathen like me, I don't think it kicks in as quickly. I'm like, well, let's see if we can get away with this. Okay, so what happens in that situation is they hook you up, and then whether these are effective really depends on who's administering them. They can be really effective if you have somebody who's really well trained with administering polygraphs. But what they would do is, let's say I get taken in and they think I murdered someone, right? They ask me a set of baseline questions to assess how activated my sympathetic nervous system is right now because I'm being given a polygraph, right? Which is kind of stressful, right? So they ask me what I had for breakfast and what my middle name is and if I can remember anything from whenever, and nothing related to whether I cut her up and stuck her in the trunk at all. And then after they get my baseline, they start asking me questions that are related to this stuff, right? Did you see her on Thursday? No. It goes up, right? Did you cut her up and stick her in the trunk? No, right? Is that your blood on the knife? Yes, right? And so you like assess all of that, and then what comes out is basically you were probably not being honest about your answers to these questions. But the good thing is in this country, none of those are admissible in court. Polygraphs are not admissible in court. So if I didn't kill her, and I'm already a suspect, right? Go take the damn polygraph test, right? You could get eliminated as a suspect, but none of that stuff can ever be admissible in court here in the United States. It is in other countries. But it's still really interesting. I totally want to take a polygraph test. So I always put this out here. If you guys are law enforcement people, I want to take one. I want to see how I do. I want to have a video of it so that I can show it in class. And you can tell whether I killed her and put her in the trunk, because it didn't. Okay, all right. All right, so now let's go add in the neurotransmitter activity. Okay, so efferent nervous system, we already said this first part, but let's make sure we've got it. Anatomic organization of efferent neurons and synapses. Somatic, we already talked about. One neuron stretching from CNS to the effector, one synapse, called the neuromuscular junction. Cell body is in the CNS. Axon is the only thing that runs through the PNS. No ganglia on the way. Neurotransmitter is always acetylcholine, yes. Always excitatory, and you guys know this, but tell me that you know it. The mechanism of excitation right here is going to be to open what kind of channels? Sodium, and cause what kind of polarization? Depolarization. This synapse would be what ergic? Cholinergic, good. And then the autonomic is where it gets different. The cell body of neuron 1 is in the CNS, and its synapses in a ganglion, which is in the PNS, and the cell body of neuron 1 starts in the ganglion and ends up at the effector. So there's one exception to that rule, and let me just show you that. So they call it a 2-neuron chain in the autonomic nervous system. The only exception to that is this little guy right here. So here's the sympathetic neuron, the preganglionic one, but notice that the postganglionic one doesn't have an axon. Do you see that? So it's a weird looking neuron. Do you see it? Okay. And as a matter of fact, it doesn't, the things that are neurotransmitter-like chemicals, it just dumps into the interstitial fluid and they get picked up by the bloodstream, so they end up acting as a hormone, right? So it's kind of an exception to a 2-neuron chain, but what this guy really is, guys, is an anaxonic neuron that they call a chromaffin cell. So it's kind of an exception to the rule, but not really, right? It just dumps it. But that's how it ends up actually being a hormone, right? It dumps a neurotransmitter-like chemical into the interstitial fluid, which gets picked up as a hormone. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so neurotransmitters. So now let's go to the neurotransmitters. And this is a figure that I just posted for you guys, and I think it's phenomenal. And it's got so much information on it, but what we're going to do is we're going to build it first, then we're going to go back and revisit the figure so that you can see how much information is on there. It's not from your textbook, but I just posted it under assignments and announcements. Okay, so now we haven't filled in the neurotransmitter detail, okay? So here's the neurotransmitter detail. So the preganglionic neurons always release acetylcholine in both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So that means that if this were a general diagram, we could add acetylcholine there, right? If we wanted to do it more specifically, we could add acetylcholine here and here. Good? Okay, and here's one other thing, and then I will give you something to avoid memorization. Acetylcholine is always excitatory when it's released right here. It's always excitatory to the postganglionic neuron. So it's excitatory here, it's excitatory here, and it's excitatory here. So now that means I can make a couple of blanket statements which keep you from having to memorize anything. The blanket statement is that, look, in the entire efferent nervous system, acetylcholine is always released first. Do you see? Even if there's not a second, it's always released first, okay? And when it's released first, it is always excitatory. Yes? That makes sense? Okay. And then you don't have to memorize very much, okay? Because now all we have to do is look at this location right here and see what's happening, okay? All right, so the preganglionic neurons of both divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, release acetylcholine. It binds to nicotinic cholinergic receptors, and it's always excitatory to that postganglionic neuron. By the way, just so you know, guys, just because it's excitatory here doesn't mean it's excitatory there. It means that the chain doesn't stop in the middle, right? We haven't actually sent our message yet, so it always keeps going in the middle. Okay, so the mechanism of excitation is what you think it is. It's to open sodium channels and cause depolarization. And so you know it already, but these would be what ergic synapses? Cholinergic, yes. Okay, and then of course the place where it has to differ is that last part of the story. Okay, the last part of the story, the postganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic division, which is here, will release acetylcholine one more time. Okay, but the effect depends on receptors on the effector. So what do I mean by that? I mean that you cannot say that postganglionic parasympathetic acetylcholine is excitatory or inhibitory unless I tell you what effector. So I want you to listen to a question, and then we'll do some more, practice some more once we do the next one. What is the impact of parasympathetic postganglionic acetylcholine on cardiac muscle? Inhibitory, exactly. But what is the effect of parasympathetic postganglionic acetylcholine on the smooth muscle of the uterus? Excitatory, right? So do you see that what you're doing is you're actually putting together the fizz of the neurotransmitters with the predictions that you already made? Does that make sense? Okay. So it always releases acetylcholine, and it depends on the receptor or on the effector what the impact is. And then this one, this is the only place that the whole story differs at all, because this releases norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay? And what's the impact? Well, it's the same. Depends on the receptor, on the effector, right? Okay, so let's do a couple of questions to have you guys practice to see if you can figure out the multiple syllables to answer, to ask a relatively simple question. Okay, what is the impact of sympathetic postganglionic norepinephrine on cardiac muscle? Excitatory. what is the effect of sympathetic postganglionic norepinephrine on the smooth muscle of the bronchioles? Inhibitory. Inhibitory, right? Okay, so do you see that it just like requires you to like think through it a little bit? Okay, and how about this? What is the effect of parasympathetic preganglionic acetylcholine? Excitatory. Parasympathetic postganglionic acetylcholine on the secretions of the digestive tract. Parasympathetic postganglionic acetylcholine, right? What is the effect of sympathetic preganglionic acetylcholine? Excitatory, right? So basically it's just a really wordy way to ask you to figure out whether you understand the predictive nature of what these two things do, right? Go ahead.
So on the preganglionic, it's generally always excitatory.
It's always excitatory.
Right.
Excitatory here,
Just like
excitatory here.
skeletal muscle.
Yeah,
It's just
right.
acetylcholine.
So that was the rule that we made before. Acetylcholine is always released first in the entire efferent nervous system, and when released first, it is excitatory, right? So it ends up simplifying a little bit once you actually build the whole damn story and then look for the pattern in the story, then it simplifies, right? Not like amazingly simple, but you know.
And
Go ahead.
Neuroepinephrine, epinephrine are always the
Postganglionic,
postganglionic.
sympathetic neurotransmitters. Yes, that's those. Go ahead.
Those are the only neurotransmitters that are also hormones.
Acetylcholine. No, dopamine is a hormone and a neurotransmitter too. There are several. We're going to do some hormones next time. I can think of at least 4. Okay, so now I'm going to show you this figure again that I posted for you because you can see how much information is in this figure. Okay, so this compares somatic and autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system, only an axon all the way to the effector, and the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, and it's always, they use stimulatory, but it's the same thing as excitatory, right? Okay, effector is always skeletal muscle. And then if we do sympathetic, we have sympathetic, notice the shorter preganglionic, so the ganglia are closer to the spinal cord. So sympathetic releases acetylcholine, right? And then the sympathetic will release norepinephrine, and here are the effectors, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. What's the impact? Well, it depends on the receptor and the effector. And then this is the only exception, right? Which is this one, which is the adrenal medulla, right? So it releases acetylcholine, but then acetylcholine causes that second cell to release epi and norepi into the bloodstream, right? Which enhances and prolongs the fight or flight response. Good. And then parasympathetic, longer pre, shorter post, okay? Acetylcholine, excitatory, acetylcholine, can't decide unless you tell me what's going on right here, okay? So this figure has a bunch of information on it, and I posted it for you. It's under assignments and announcements. Good? Okay, so I know you guys want to do more autonomic nervous system, but we're done. Actually, we just have to make sure that we get these filled in. So postganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic division release acetylcholine, which binds to muscarinic cholinergic receptors. And so that synapse would be what, ergic? Cholinergic. And then postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic division release norepinephrine or epi, more norepi than epi. And this synapse would be what, ergic? Adrenergic. And the effects of either can be excitatory or inhibitory depending on what they were attached to. Receptors, good. All right, good, you're done. Woo! Everybody loves the autonomic nervous system. It's just people's favorite.
Why does it depend on the receptors and effectors?
It's which receptors are on that effector.
So the effector is the gland.
The effector is the tissue, right? But, for instance, we saw an instance in which smooth muscle in the wall of a blood vessel had an excitatory receptor, and the other smooth muscle has...
Those receptors are just different...
They're different proteins. Different proteins that are expressed in the tissue, developmentally expressed in the tissue.
But it's the same acetylcholine for the parasympathetic.
It is the same chemical, right? So the way that I like to think about it is if I was speaking the same language, but you guys were interpreting the language. For instance, sometimes, is it Greek? I think in Greek, ne means yes. But if I say ne to you and I say ne to her, right.
That was awesome. Or sick.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it depends on how you hear it, right? I can say the same thing and you can hear it multiple different ways. Does that make sense? Okay.
That's long.
Huh?
That's long.
Yeah, it is.
I have a question. So
Go ahead.
if you're like driving down the
Which should go.
saliva and
Oh.
It should, yeah, they do that.
or if you're like about to give a lecture and you're nervous, if you ate something while you're waiting like an apple, would it help you?
Well, that is something that I need to tell you, that it's not all or nothing. So you can turn on your sympathetic nervous system massively, or you can turn it on, a little bit, and you can turn on the parasympathetic massively or a little bit. So the answer is that would probably help, but it probably wouldn't turn it
Right.
completely off,
But
right?
telling your body there's a need for something else might redirect.
Yeah, it could potentially. Oh, but let's take just a second and readdress something that comes up for me when I give this lecture, is that this lecture is all about what the PNS is doing, right? It's all about what the PNS is doing. We also have to acknowledge that we told this story about what the CNS would be doing in the same situation, right? Remember how we were talking about, like, in these situations in which you get like super stressed out, what the central nervous system would be doing? It would be releasing different neurotransmitters, right? It would be like, for instance, releasing endorphins, right? Your neuropeptides. It might be releasing some dopamine. It might be releasing some of those things in the CNS, and then the PNS is doing its own thing. And ideally what they're doing is they're reinforcing the behavior of each one. What ultimately is going to have an impact is your assessment of the situation as stressful. If you can change your perception of the situation as stressful, you can turn off or down the sympathetic nervous system. So that probably would have an even greater effect than, for instance, chewing some gum. So if I can talk myself down, like, what cognitive behavioral therapy? I'm scared of freaking spiders or something, and then like they allow a spider to crawl on me and I don't die, right? And I don't die multiple times, and then the next time I see a damn spider, what happens? I get less dramatic sympathetic nervous system response, right? So sort of that cognitive behavioral therapy can train you to figure out whether, and you know, if somebody like walks into the door right now with a gun, which, you know, is not that unlikely, I will probably lose control of my bodily functions, right? I'm just so you know, I am not a healer, because there's a door right there, and don't think I haven't found it. So I'm 5'2", you guys take it. But if it happens to a soldier, do they have the same massive sympathetic nervous system response? They don't, because of the training, right? And a cop in Compton has a gun pulled on him or her, 15 times over the course of a month, right? That's right. But I have literally never had it happen to me. And so the impact of like what your perception of stress is can dramatically change whether this turns on or off. And it dramatically changes your CNS neurotransmitters, but also your PNS neurotransmitters. And I talk about that, by the way, in the next episode at the very end. We talk about the stress response and the impact of short-term and long-term stress on your body, because it actually becomes hormonal too. Okay, so we're going to start an endocrine system.
Oh, I thought that was.
No, we got 15 minutes.
The way you looked at us, you're like, oh.
No. I'm done with that, but we're starting a new thing. Okay, so here's what endocrine system is going to be. Okay, so the endocrine system, how long are these damn notes? Too long. 20 pages.
Yeah.
Yeah, but look, that page is like half full. Right? That page is like 2/3 full. Right? Okay. Yeah, they're long. The endocrine system is complicated, and it's hard to understand, and you are going to have to put time in outside of class regularly in order to get it. So I know that a lot of times with phys, if you just listen to me and you're a smart person, you'll totally get it, right? But with the endocrine system, you're going to have to listen to me, be a smart person, and then study, memorize like you do in anatomy, because you are going to have 32 different hormones. I think it's 32 different hormones to memorize where they came from, where they go to, what their chemistry is, and what they do, okay? But we're going to go through it together. You will probably end up liking the endocrine system, but it'll be one of those things like, in retrospect, I like that, but I freaking hated it in the moment. So we're going to start on Roman numeral 2. We're going to talk about the basic functions of the endocrine system. First off, let's also conceptualize that these guys are at no disadvantage, because you never learned anything about endocrine system anatomy, did you? No, you didn't. Because it doesn't look like a body system. Even though we call it the endocrine system, It doesn't look like a body system because how do these organs communicate with one another? Through the bloodstream. Well, how many things have blood vessels going through them? All of them, right? So it's not like it looks like the pituitary gland is controlling ovarian function, but it is, right? They're just connected via the bloodstream. So it releases hormones that actually just end up finding receptors here. So they don't look like a classical body system at all. We don't even usually talk about it in anatomy because it doesn't have like any anatomical, like no light bulbs are going to go off when you look at the anatomy. So it's not like the urinary system. It's like the kidneys make the pee and the ureters take the pee. And the urinary bladder holds the pee until the urethra gets rid of the pee. So it's not like that. So you didn't learn any of it. So you've got some organs that you may or may not realize have endocrine function. And the other thing is they're not all glands. I know we are typically in the habit of referring to things that release hormones as endocrine glands, but they're not all glands. Like the heart releases hormones and the kidneys release hormones, right? And those are decidedly not glands, right? But so does, of course, the pituitary gland, which is, and the thyroid, which is. So we call them endocrine organs to allow room for all of them. And the wall of the digestive tract releases a bunch of them too. So let's talk about the big picture understanding of the endocrine system, and then we won't get into anything too hairy about the endocrine system today, just sort of a big picture understanding of it. Okay, so what's the endocrine system doing? Well, it's pretty much doing what you would expect it to. It's trying to maintain homeostasis by producing control and communication. The deal with the endocrine system, though, is that compared to the other body system that does control and communication, it's a little slower to communicate, but its messages last longer, right? Right, because it's hormonal. The other communication and control system is what? Nervous system. By the way, those two are best buds. They really reinforce and enhance one another. And we will see that sometimes you can release something that, for instance, we thought was a neurotransmitter and ends up having hormonal function. And so we will see that they actually sort of reinforce one another. Okay, so endocrine systems are not all glands, but they all do release hormones. And remember, what makes it a hormone is not its chemistry, it's how it travels, right? It travels through the bloodstream. And is there any limit on how many places that hormone can find receptors? No, there isn't. So it's going to have potentially massive widespread effects on the body, but not within a matter of nanoseconds, right? It's going to be like a little slower, but much more widespread. And so hormones will act upon what we call target cells. But it's kind of a circular definition because a target cell is anything with a what for the hormone? Receptor, exactly. So, okay, so let's talk about how hormones work so that you can get an appreciation of the complexity of the endocrine system. And then I will tell you that I won't nitpick you on the complexity unless it's like a really important part of like pathophysiology or like type 2 diabetes. So, endocrine system is fascinating, and I like literally have never gotten done studying it. I still read about it all the time. It's complex enough that I continue to learn and educate myself on it all the time. But let's start with the simple way that it can work. So the general simple way that the endocrine system can work is that the organ is going to release the hormone, and it's going to release it into the interstitial fluid. But endocrine organs tend to be very, very vascular, lots and lots of capillaries, and usually the capillaries are fenestrated, which means that if I release a large quantity of something into the interstitial fluid of an endocrine organ, it gets picked up by the bloodstream really quickly, right? So they're just super duper vascular with like really greedy little capillaries, okay? So I'm going to release it, and then it's going to get picked up by the bloodstream. And it's going to circulate not inside the blood cells, but in the blood plasma, right? It's going to be in the plasma. That's how it's going to get from point A to point B. And what's going to be the hormone's fate? So it's going to get dumped into the blood plasma, and then what happens to it? Well, there's a bunch of possibilities. Let's do the simple one, and then we'll go back and add some complexity so that you can understand like how tricky endocrinology can be. First, let's say it's going to do this. The hormone is going to go straight from where it's released into the bloodstream to its target cell in its current form. Do not pass go. Nothing special happens to it on the way there. And that can happen. And then once it gets to its target cell, it's going to interact with the receptor, right? And then it's going to cause the target cell response. How does it cause the target cell response? Well, via those signal transduction pathways that we already talked about. So for instance, if it was a lipid-soluble hormone like testosterone, how is it going to cause its response on skeletal muscle cell, gene activation, to cause myosin synthesis, for instance, right? That makes sense? If it is a water soluble, it could do any number of things. It could open or close an ion channel, G protein, all of that business. So that's the end of the story that we already talked about. So this, really, all you can say is that it's definitely going to do something to the target cell that wasn't happening before. Otherwise, why bother, right? And then sometimes you'll worry about the complexity, but in this set of notes, we generally won't. We'll say it interacts and it causes this response, and most of the time I won't even make you memorize what kind of receptor it interacts with, because people hate that crap. Okay, but let's back up a little bit, because sometimes it doesn't just go from point A to point B without passing go or collecting $200. Sometimes things happen to it on the way. So let's see. If it gets released by the cell and then gets dumped into the bloodstream, sometimes it's released in an inactive form. And if it's released in an inactive form, it has to be activated on its way there, or sometimes by the target cell. So let me give you an example and why the hell you care about this. Testosterone, which is mostly made by the testes, but you make some testosterone-like chemicals elsewhere as well. Testosterone is released, but it's released in an inactive form. So I want to imagine an adult male that all of a sudden seems to have the symptoms of low testosterone. He's going to be super exhausted and losing muscle mass, and sex drive drops. Okay? So, but then, so you go to the endocrinologist and they say, well, I'm going to test your testosterone levels. But the testosterone levels look totally fine. As a matter of fact, they might even be slightly high. Well, what can happen there is testosterone actually has to be activated in order to cause the target cell response. If it doesn't get activated, can you see how you would have all of the symptoms of low testosterone, but if you measured your testosterone level, it would be normal. Even just slightly high, by the way, because the body starts to try to overcompensate. Does that make sense? Okay. So some hormones are released in an inactive form. They have to be activated. Now, why do you care? You would treat those two situations totally differently, right? Okay. So what else could happen? Some hormones their concentration can be lowered as they go through circulation, because they don't just go from point A to point B. They also go through the liver and the kidneys, right? So what if my liver is over-metabolizing the hormone, right? So what if I had the symptoms of, for instance, hypothyroid? Started losing my hair and gaining weight and super duper exhausted, right? And then they test my thyroid level, and it looks like my thyroid is making normal amounts, but I don't have normal amounts in my bloodstream. What the hell is going on? Well, what if my liver is over-metabolizing, right? Then it's a liver problem, and I don't treat it as a thyroid problem, right? Does that make sense? Okay, and then sometimes one hormone actually catalyzes the activation of another hormone. And so you can have, for instance, in a child, what might look like a growth hormone abnormality. You've got this child who's like not growing enough. And you're like, oh, okay, well, there's a growth hormone abnormality, so we're going to test the growth hormone level. But the growth hormone level is fine, but it actually has to be activated by thyroid hormone. And so it's actually a thyroid problem that ends up looking like a growth problem. So why am I torturing you with these things? Because I want you to understand the complexity of the endocrine system. If you dump everything into the bloodstream, then you can't just predict its effect by saying, release, target cell, right? Because a lot of things can happen to it on the way there. That's why I want to convince you that, like, if you ever have an endocrine problem, you probably need to go to a doctor who's been trained in endocrinology, right? Because this is not a specialty for dumb people, right? Definitely not. Hi, how are you? You can go to your doctor if you have a thyroid problem, and then they can treat you initially for thyroid, and then you get on maybe the 6-month waiting list to get to an endocrinologist. Because I don't know for sure, but I think when I first started teaching here, there were only 3 endocrinologists in all of Salt Lake City, and you know how big a medical community we have, right? Enormous. And I think now that there are 7, right? So you are still going to wait a while to get into an endocrinologist. But you need that, because you actually have to be able to test, like, really look like down at the granular level and figure out what's actually going on. So will I torture you with that kind of stuff? No, not unless it's actually really relevant to something I think you're going to run into later. Like the testosterone one's kind of interesting. Okay, so let's talk about what you guys are going to do. So for those of you who are truly motivated, both of you, you're going to start on your endocrine table before you actually come to class. And what you are going to do is next time we're going to look at the chemistry of all of the hormones, right? And why the hell do you care about the chemistry? Well, that determines where you're going to find the receptor. It determines whether you're going to be able to release it by diffusion or exocytosis, right? It also determines something about the transporting lipid-soluble hormones is a little bit more complicated than transporting water-soluble ones. Go ahead.
That's what the activation is too. Is chemistry is.
Yeah, the activation is chemistry as well. So you can go through the chemistry, and I'm going to categorize all of these, but just so you know, you're not going to have time to fill in that table during class, but if you get most of it filled in before you come to class and then you can tweak it, then you're going to have a lot more confidence, right? So you could very easily fill in like the first 3 columns of the table within this next week before we even got finished with it. So I'm not going to quiz you guys until Tuesday. It'll be autonomic and first part of endocrine on Tuesday. So I will see you on Thursday. I'm going to stop there.
Where did you say that table is?
It's right after your notes, right after your endocrine notes on the notes page. Hi.
I was hoping you could help me with a